Whoa. Did you guys hear that? Does it always do that?
That's the first time I've heard it, but cool. First time too.
Yeah, first time you ever heard that.
I heard it this morning at Elias's coaching.
That's funny. Well, doesn't it show, it's like so everybody knows, but doesn't it also show on your Zooms when it's being recorded? So it's not like you're being like sneakily recorded?
Yes, and then I also heard it this morning on Elias's training or team meeting.
Must be new. Okay, so we talked about those forms. One thing I realized that we've gotten to this point and haven't really gone into detail in, and I know it's one of the more difficult things to kind of wrap your head around as a new agent, is contingencies. Like, we didn't go through it when we were talking about buyers presentations, because that's something you really want to be able to explain. And we did, since we're not going into as much detail on the RPA, we didn't talk about it. So I'm going to take some time today and go through the contingencies, because I think that's a super important thing. One, to understand how they work, because they can have a major effect on the transaction. And they also are important when it comes to strategizing how to write an offer, because you hear about good terms. And typically when people are talking about good terms, there's the financing terms. So, you know, how much down payment, what type of loan and all that. And then the other big component of an offer's terms are the contingencies. So we'll go through that in some detail today. If there's any other kind of big sections of the RPA, we talked last week a little bit about the liquidated damages and the arbitration sections. Those are important to understand because they technically are optional, but it's incredibly difficult to get an offer accepted without those. Those are sections that you want to really be able to understand and explain, because it's important that your clients understand what they're signing when it comes to those two sections. But if there's any other sections in the RPA that you have questions about from, you know, your experience with them so far, from what we've covered, drop them in the chat and we'll try to cover it. But I wanted to make sure we go over contingencies. But before we do that, I wanted to go through just a quick explanation of SkySlope. We talked about Zip Forms last week. So Zip Forms is like your internal library of forms. It's where you keep all your transactions organized. It's where you can access all the CAR documents. It's integrated with DocuSign, so it's really easy to work out of when you're writing offers or working transactions and you need to get forms signed by clients. So Zip Forms is where you will be working out of and creating the forms and the documents. SkySlope comes into play once you have an offer accepted, and SkySlope is you work in it a little bit, but typically it's your transaction coordinator and then the EXP like file review people. SkySlope is how you get those people the documents, and it's really cool. It's like organizes the transaction into different sections and all the documents you need. In order for a transaction to be approved by the broker, a certain number of documents need to be included in the file and signed by both the buyer and seller. And SkySlope is essentially like an online checklist for all those documents. So you're going to need to have everything in there and approved in order for a file to be approved. And if it's not, if you have continued issues with it, then it can be difficult. It can make it difficult to get your payment on time. And it's incredibly difficult to chase down documents once the transaction's closed. So it's really important that there's different stages in the transaction where you make sure your file is up to date and compliant. Because once something's closed, it can be pretty difficult to get everything completed, and it might not seem like an issue at the time, but if there's a problem with the home or the transaction or something between the buyers and sellers later, and you go back and you have a file that's not complete, that could be big trouble for you as the agent. So super important that your file is complete, and SkySlope is the tool that helps you do that. So this is kind of what it looks like. Just an overview at the top. I know it's hard to see, but it gives you an idea. It has the transaction details, and then there's these checklists. So once you get in a transaction, you'll periodically get an email with this checklist, and you want it to look like this. You want there to be a lot of green, because that means that the file is, or the document that is on the list is included and signed off and complete. The light blue, I think, is if required or if applicable. So some of those documents won't apply to the transaction. And then red, which there isn't any in this example, red is documents that are required and are missing from the file. So establishing a good flow with the transaction coordinator and making sure that they're getting the documents. You're getting them any documents that are coming directly to you. Like ideally, when the transaction starts, you introduce the transaction coordinator. Typically, the other side will too, and then they'll be included on the majority of the emails. But sometimes, there's negotiating, and you're going through things, and documents get missed, and the TC gets left off. So make it a good habit to make sure that you're in a timely manner getting your TC the documents they need, so they can keep your SkySlope up to date. Typically, you as an agent are not, your main interaction with SkySlope is reviewing these checklists when you get them and making sure that there's not a bunch of red boxes. It's a transaction coordinator that's, but they can only, do so much. And if you're not making sure that they're getting the documents during the transaction, they can't get them into SkySlope.
John, sorry I jumped in late, but when do we actually put our transaction into SkySlope?
So typically, you won't do a transaction until it's in contract, and typically it will be the transaction coordinator that will start it. So usually the first step, once you have a signed contract, is getting it out to all the parties that need it to start their jobs. So obviously title and escrow and the lender, but included on that is the transaction coordinator. And usually their first step, once they get the contract documents, is to start a SkySlope file. So again, this is how the files and the documents get to EXP. So super important to make sure that it's all done properly, because this is what gets you paid. This is how it being entered in SkySlope and sent to the broker for review is how EXP becomes aware of the transaction. So you want to do everything, in an organized and timely fashion, because you never want to be playing catch up when it comes to having a complete file. But to answer your question, Amy, it's typically, as soon as a contract is ratified, the TC will start the SkySlope. And I highly, highly encourage everybody to use a transaction coordinator. It's anywhere from, typically $400 to $500. But in the amount of time that it saves you when it comes to, some agents are really, really organized and can understand all this. Even then, I think that, your time is valuable when you're busy. And this is something where there's a lot of value in having a transaction coordinator do it. And you can kind of follow along and be a little bit more involved on the SkySlope side if you want to, really understand how it works. But I really kind of discourage people doing their files on their own, because you don't know what you need. Even with the checklists, it can be confusing. There's different documents depending on what cities it's in. The transaction coordinators for that, $400, $500. Not only are they going to just save you a ton of time and keep it way more organized, they're going to make sure everything's done right and that your file is going to be compliant. Again, highly encourage using a transaction coordinator. They're going to be doing the work in SkySlope for you. Any questions? Or Karina, do you have anything to add on SkySlope and kind of best practices, or anything you think agents should know?
I just kind of added it to the chat, but basically just kind of making sure that you understand that it is your responsibility. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's your license, it's your client. You're the one that's responsible for making sure your client knows what they're signing and explaining. And the TC is the one that's just kind of making sure that the signatures go where they're supposed to and the dates are on there and things. They're not running the details of they are running the details of the transaction, but you're the one that's managing it and making sure that it's all, explained to your clients properly. And then just a note to make sure that you get your accepted offers and listing agreements uploaded to SkySlope. Usually that's the TC that's going to upload them for you, but you want to get that as quickly as you can, as soon as it's signed to your TC, to get that in. And then also just a shameless plug to let me know when that happens.
Yeah, definitely. That Karina needs to be made aware when there are new contracts. So, we can do everything we need to do on our end. And yeah, within 48 hours, it should be updated to SkySlope. So well within 48 hours, literally within, unless it's 11 o'clock at night, which, will happen where you get a ratified contract, within a couple hours of having a fully executed RPA, you want to get it in the hands of everybody that needs it, especially with these quick, short escrows. If you're taking a couple days to get it to the lender, time is of the essence, and you'll read that time is of the essence in the contract, and you're expected to act in good faith and work fast, because waiting a couple days to get the title company or the lender the documents they need to get started can literally create a delay in closing escrow on time. Martinique, did you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick. So this last transaction I did, EXP, is it that they also send you updates from SkySlope? I was just a little confused because EXP was sending me stuff, but my TCs like already had it, and I was a little thrown off.
Yeah. So EXP will go into periodically. I don't know exactly what their schedule is, but they'll go in periodically throughout a transaction and review the file, and you'll get an email with this checklist.
Right.
So those are important for you to review, because you want to know what's missing, because you want to be ahead of it. So if you see documents on that checklist that are red, then you either know that you need to get those documents to your TC, or ask your TC why we haven't gotten it back from the seller yet. Or they might be something like, oh, that contingency removal I did myself. I sent it to the other side. I forgot to copy my TC on it. So when you get those SkySlope updates from EXP, you want to make sure to take a minute and review the missing files. So if you need to take any action on your part, some of them are going to be missing, the verification of property, that's obviously going to be missing in the middle of transaction because it's not done until the very end. But if it's something like, there's no pre-approval and verification of funds added, you might have just not included that to your TC, so they couldn't upload it. So pay attention to those emails. But yes, you do get reminders from EXP, and it's when they review the files.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So I think that kind of wraps it up on SkySlope. Obviously, if you have any questions, let us know. Again, you don't really use it that much yourself, but it's important for you to know like how it fits into a transaction and the purpose it serves, because it's a pretty cool tool. Like, back in the day, and back, not even that long ago, there used to be like transaction coordinators or agents would use these like folders. You get them from title companies, and they'd be these folders with like 10 different tabs, and you'd put all the documents in there, and have like paper checklists and kind of manually go through and make sure you had all the paperwork. SkySlope makes it really easy, not only to like organize everything, but to send it back and forth between the broker and the transaction coordinator and the agent. So TC is really important, and SkySlope's a big part of what they use. So we're going to get into some of these additional commonly used forms. We talked about the RPA last time, but I want to get into contingencies first. I feel like, as a new agent, it's something that you really need to understand. And even experienced agents, there's like can be a lot of nuances to contingencies. And I had a pretty experienced agent call me today with like a question about an appraisal situation, and with the way offers are being written these days, and people kind of doing everything they can to give themselves an edge and make their terms as attractive as possible, it can be a little confusing on exactly where like contingencies stand. So is there anyone on here that wants to just give like a brief overview of like their understanding of contingencies? Like, just take a shot at it. I know there's some experienced agents on here too, but I just want to hear kind of the common understanding. No? Okay. So
yeah, so basically my understanding of contingency, basically it's a protection clause around the contract itself for your client to protect their earnest money deposit. So there's a loan contingency, there's an appraisal contingency, and then you have inspection contingencies. You have certain amount of days to accomplish these tasks. And once that you have X amount of days to complete that, once that is removed, then you're removing the appraisal contingency upon whatever timeline you have agreed on the contract. And once all contingencies are removed, basically there's no turning back for your clients. And at this point, your earnest money deposit becomes non-refundable.
Yeah, that's basically it, like the contingencies and overview. And really, when you're explaining it to a client, when you're either during the buyer's presentation or writing their first offer, I think a good time to introduce it and explain it is after, you're going through the terms and you're like, okay, we're going to settle on a purchase price of X amount, you're doing 20% down and these are the finance terms. And then you want to explain that there is almost always an earnest money deposit included in a transaction. And we haven't really gone in detail in that either. So for the new agents, earnest money deposit, sometimes called like the good faith deposit, you'll hear it referred to as the EMD. It's a line item on the first page of the RPA, and you put the amount that the buyers are going to deposit to escrow. Typically, it's due within it's due within 3 business days of an offer being accepted. One thing I'm seeing a lot of these days is people are asking, or they're countering with earnest money deposit and escrow within 24 hours, especially on non-contingent offers, because that earnest money deposit is essentially what commits the buyer to following through with the contract. Without that, you could write, a crazy aggressive offer with no contingencies, but if you never deposit that earnest money, then the seller has nothing to go after. And that goes back to the liquidated damages section of the contract on page 8 that we talked about last week, that you're agreeing to essentially put your deposit on the table if there is to be a breach of contract. So after I explain the earnest money, which is typically 3% of the purchase price, and the reason that it's 3% of the purchase price normally is that with liquidated damages, 3% of the purchase price is the most that the seller can retain if they're able to prove damages. So in $1 million transaction, if you're writing a $2,000 deposit to the seller, it looks like you're minimizing the risk of canceling the contract. So yeah, maybe you write a non-contingent offer and go through, but if your deposit's only $2,000, obviously that's a lot of money. But when it comes to a transaction like this, like someone might be willing to just bail on it, or if there's, maybe the loan isn't as solid as they want you to believe or whatever, a small deposit is less risk for the buyers if they're trying to just bail out. So normally sellers want to see that 3% because that signals that, hey, me as a buyer, I'm putting as much skin in the game, or whatever you want to say. Like they're maximizing the risk, and to a seller and to a listing agent, having the full 3% deposit shows that you are committed to following through in the transaction and not trying to minimize your exposure by putting in a small deposit amount. Sometimes you will see increased deposits where it's like, this is pretty rare. Like I've never done it in my career, I don't think, and I don't know how often people do, but you'll see it on the contract that you can do increased deposit where, upon acceptance of the contract, the buyer will deposit $5,000 into escrow, and then at some point in the transaction, they'll increase the deposit to an additional $20,000 or whatever. It's not done very often, but just so you know, it does exist. I don't really think that anybody uses it anymore, especially with how fast transactions go. So the contingencies are what protect that buyer's deposit. The buyers have more, the contract has a lot more protections built in for the buyers than it does the sellers. With the contingencies, it gives the buyer a right to cancel within a specified time period and for certain reasons. Sellers can't cancel a contract. Once a contract's ratified, sellers can only cancel a contract if the buyer does not perform. And we can talk about that another time, what that means and what, cancellation, how that works. But for the purpose of understanding contingencies, just know that it gives the buyer a right to cancel during the contingency period. So a few things that apply to all contingency periods. So it's spelled out in the contract as a number of days. It defaults in the contract to 17 days. It's pretty rare, at least in the local markets, for people to be writing 17-day contingencies. And it's not just the time that, obviously if somebody's waiting 21 days, 30 days for it to close, like 17-day contingency is, it's not going to change how fast they get their money, but sellers aren't going to be confident that a deal is done, or more confident that, they can plan on the deal being done until those contingencies are removed. So a buyer that wants 17 days for inspections or needs 17 days to get their loan fully approved, that just signals to the other side that you're not as committed to the transaction. And that's why, the length of these terms, when it comes to, the nitty gritty of comparing offers, sometimes really short contingency periods, as opposed to really long ones, might sway an offer in one direction. You say it's $5,000 less. It's not like they're just waiting 5 more days, 15, 17, 12 more days for the additional $5,000. It's also the risk that's perceived. So long contingencies are perceived by listing agents and sellers as riskier offers because the buyers, you know, either have some kind of issues they need to work through, or they're just less committed overall, and they're trying to give themselves a bigger window to cancel. And that makes the sellers nervous because you want, you know, days on market and going back on the market, those are something that can really hurt the value of a property. So oftentimes a property might go on the back on the market because the, you know, buyers straight up got cold feet or couldn't actually afford it or whatever, and that can hurt the perceived value of the property because, you know, even if it had nothing to do with the property itself and it was just, you know, buyer got excited and then changed their mind, it hurts the perceived value of that property on the open market. So sellers are really cautious of you know, going through and making sure that buyers are committed. And that goes back again to like establishing a relationship with the listing agent. Like, one, not only that you're like a good and professional agent that they want to work with, but that your buyers are committed. And if you're fortunate enough to get your offer accepted, that you're going to follow through and there's not going to be any issues, because going back on the market as a listing agent is one of, you know, something that you really, really don't ever want to do. So when it comes to the time period, there's a couple things to note. Contingencies run concurrently. So if you have, you know, there's loan, appraisal, and inspection. We'll go through each one. But if you have 10-day contingencies for all of them, day one of they all run at the same time. So on the 11th day of the contract, all of those contingencies are due to be removed. So when it comes to time frames, one thing to remember is they're concurrent, and then the other thing to remember is that they have to be removed in writing. It's not like on a 10-day contingency on the 11th day, that contingency is just gone and now the seller's deposit or the buyer's deposit is at risk. It has to be removed in writing. There's a contingency removal form, and you specify what contingencies you're removing and what you're leaving in place. And until that is signed by the buyer, then that contingency remains in effect. So even with a 10-day contingency, if they don't sign that form in, you know, 11 or 12 days, that contingency is still in effect. And this is when we start talking about what gives the sellers the right to cancel. So I was saying in the beginning that as long as the buyers are doing everything that they've outlined in the contract and performing to their terms, the sellers can't cancel. Once buyers start to get away from what they are required to do and obligated to do in the contract, that's what can open the window for a seller to cancel. So in the event of contingencies, if you committed to a 10-day inspection contingency and on day 11, you haven't removed it yet, what the seller can do is issue what's called a notice to perform. And typically by default, a notice to perform, they'll specify what you're supposed to do, and then you have 2 days to do it. So they'll issue a notice to perform to remove your inspection contingency. Once they've issued a notice to perform, if you don't do what you're contractually obligated to do, then the seller can cancel. So buyers don't have to remove the contingency in the amount of days that they specify, but if they don't, that leaves a window where the seller can cancel on them. So contingencies removed in writing is, I think, an important thing to explain to your client, because you really want to, like when you're asking them to put, you know, $15,000, $35,000, $60,000 into escrow, you really want to make sure that you make it clear to them how that money is protected and, you know, at what point that money is at risk. And I always tell them when we're talking about the deposit, I'll make it really clear to you when we get to the point in that transaction where that deposit is no longer refundable. Or if it's a non-contingent offer, and, you know, we talk about non-contingent offers a lot in training, because I think you hear about how, you know, common they are, for better or worse, in this market. If it's a non-contingent offer, as soon as they put that deposit in, that deposit is at risk if they cancel the contract or breach it in any way. So making sure that they really understand that, like, you never want to be in a situation where something happens and your seller thinks they're going to get their deposit back, and that's not the case. So being really, really clear and making, you know, taking the time to make sure they understand how it all functions and what it all means is super important. And this is why sometimes, you know, writing the first offers can take a while, is because you're taking the time to really go through these big things in detail with them. So once you've had one offer, and hopefully you're not writing a ton, but, you know, in this market, you're usually writing at least a couple. You don't have to go through all this in detail each time, but it just makes it super important that the first time everybody's on the same page and it's really clear what this all means, because you don't want to just be writing offers and then, your fifth offer gets accepted and then you realize that they don't fully understand how the deposits work and, what could be at risk. So that covers the overall effect of the contingencies and how they work as far as time periods. And so we'll go into detail a little bit on each one. So the inspection contingency is fairly self-explanatory. It gives the buyer time to do their due diligence in obtaining any inspections, but also doing anything else when it comes to verifying that the property will work for them. So one thing that you always want to make sure that your buyers do during the inspection contingency is get insurance. For a lot of properties, it's not a big deal, but there's areas where insurance companies might require extra earthquake insurance, or flood is a common one, or these days like fire insurance. Insurance being more expensive or really difficult to get because it's in a high fire zone. That could be a deal breaker. Like if they need a flood policy that's going to be $5,000 a year, that could one, they're not going to want to do it, but it also could make it so they don't qualify for that payment anymore, because now they have an extra $450 to $500 a month commitment because they need that flood policy. If you find out that that's the case after your contingency removed, you could be in trouble. So insurance, schools, like if they're buying in a certain area because they really want a specific school, you need to make it clear to them that, hey, like during this contingency period, or ideally before you even write the offer, they're certain that they can get the school they want. Like, and then obviously just the property itself. Like I saw an email the other day, it was like, my buyers were talking to the neighbors and they found out that there was a shooting on the block and now they want to cancel. Like any and everything that they could do. I tell my buyers, like in certain areas, like, hey, go buy the property at night or go buy the property at different times of day and just kind of get a feel for it and make sure that you're still comfortable with it. Any research they can do when it comes to the property itself, that's something they want to do during the inspection contingency, because that contingency is gives them a pretty wide range of reasons that they can cancel. I mean, they can cancel because their parents didn't like it, basically, under the inspection contingency. Sometimes people will think that like we need to show an inspection report that shows that it needs a $20,000 electrical upgrade and to cancel. Like you literally can cancel it because like you decided that, there was actually way too much traffic and you didn't like the location anymore. So anything like that needs to be done during the inspection contingency. Do we have any questions on the inspection contingency? Because I think of all of them, that's the most important one that you understand. No, pretty clear. Okay.
Do you want to get into like what can trigger a new contingency window?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. So part of the, like in the section on the contract above where you put the inspection contingency, it talks about getting the seller providing the required disclosures. In most cases these days, because they're trying to encourage, one, they're trying to minimize any issues once you're in contract, but also they're trying to encourage people to waive their contingencies. Often the majority, if not all, of the seller disclosures will be available before you even write an offer. But one thing that can reopen that window once you remove that contingency is if essentially like if there's new disclosures that affect like the value of the property. So if there was a recent issue where someone was in contract on a condo and the disclosures were provided, inspection contingency was removed, and then the agent and the buyer found out that there was like some big special assessment coming and there was going to be, a huge assessment due, or HOA was going to go up substantially. Like that's a new disclosure that obviously affects the value of the property. So that reopens the window for the buyer to cancel. And Karina, remind me, how long do they have when there's after a new disclosure?
Depends on the contract, but I think the default is 5 days or whatever's in the inspection contingency. So whatever's longer.
Okay. And it has to be something, so the TDS and the SPQ, we haven't talked about seller documents, but those are some of the main required seller disclosures. It's a seller transfer disclosure statement and the seller property questionnaire, where there's both 3 pages where the seller just answers a bunch of questions about the condition of the property and the history of the property. You know, a disclosure, like somebody forgetting to sign like a generic disclosure, the seller forgetting to sign a generic disclosure is not necessarily going to reopen that contingency window, but something that is, you know, enough effect on the property to trigger a revision of those documents is something that can, you know, reopen that.
And I think in that case, it's a 3-day for like the TDS or SPQ getting revised, but for like just brand new disclosures, new disclosures, it's 5 days or the length of the inspection contingency.
Okay, got it. And then, so you know, when you get your listings, this makes it really important to make sure that you get all your disclosures as soon as possible. If ideally before it's on the market, but if that's not possible or easy, you want to make sure that within the specified time period in the contract, you get it, you know, at the very least before the buyer removes their inspection contingency, because you don't want to reopen that window. Sasha, did you have a question?
Oh, no, sorry.
All right, okay, no, I saw you come off mute. And Karina just said listing agents avid, get that in your disclosure package as soon as you can. Yes, because that is something that can reopen that window. And, you know, maybe there's not something on there that really is scary, but if it opens that window and the buyer for some reason has an issue, it gives them an out. Ashley, do you have a question?
Yes, I just want to input. I was shadowing an agent and I just, she had so many transactions going on that she didn't touch bases with her TC, and there was a disclosure that there was a death in the family and she was like a day away from closing. So I was just like, you don't want to be that agent that hasn't told your buyers something that was disclosed to you and you didn't show them that there was a death in the family, because that can really just kill the deal. And if you want, you know, sometimes you're just going to have to be like, I'll pay you those $3,000, because that's what she was willing to do because of the big mistake. And she was dying. She was like, I can't believe this happened to me. And I just wanted to input that.
Yeah, no, and that's a great input. And that's what it's like, you don't ever want to sit on any information. You want to get it to the seller or your clients as soon as possible, especially if there's a contingency removal in effect. Like quick story, like I had an experience with that a long time ago where some buyers canceled a contract, and it's a whole long story, and I think that they canceled because of some other shady reasons. But the reason that they gave me was that there was like a sunroom that wasn't permitted. It was like a screen room. It wasn't permitted. And they used that as their reason, like, oh, we're not comfortable with this unpermitted space. But one, I know I told them about it when we toured the property, but that doesn't matter because it wasn't in writing. And I didn't give them, they were the type of buyers where I wanted to give them all the disclosures when we were at the property, like together for the inspections. So I waited a couple days to like send them all the disclosures because I knew they'd have questions about it, and I knew I would see them at the property. And then they tried to say, oh, we ordered this inspection and we ordered the appraisal and it cost us $1,000. And if you had given us those disclosures a couple days earlier, we would have canceled then. And you know, we think you're responsible for this $1,000 for the appraisal and the home inspection. And it went through like our broker and everything. And the broker did say like, yeah, you had that information and you didn't give it to them in a timely manner. And so if they were to take you to court for this $1,000, they would probably win. So the situation Ashley's talking about is even worse because they were about to close, and then there's a new disclosure that would potentially cause some people to cancel the transaction. So that could be even worse. But you know, the moral of both stories is you want to, even if you think there's some good reason for hanging on to it for a day or two, you want to make sure that you get information to your buyers as quick as possible. And then obviously, you never want to withhold anything entirely from your buyers, like for a number of reasons. One, it's ethically and it's your duty to disclose everything. So a deal canceling is never worth the risk of, not disclosing something. And that goes for as a seller too. Like you never, if you know about something, even if your client doesn't want to disclose it, like it's your responsibility to disclose something like material to the property, because once that information gets out there, if it gets out there like after the fact, it could be a big problem, and you're the licensed professional in the deal, so it's really important that disclosures are handled properly.
Right. And what I took from that is just like, don't depend on your TC for the information to be out, because your TC's responsibility is to make sure that the papers are signed, not that the information is disclosed to your clients or not. Yeah.
Like Karina was saying earlier, like TCs aren't really responsible for like the content of the disclosures. They're responsible for making sure that things get signed. But if some documents come through and your TC sends it over to the clients, like make sure that you've reviewed those documents as well, and that you've pointed things out to your clients, and ask them if they have any questions. TCs just help facilitate the process. You're the person that's responsible for the content of those documents, both when it comes to reviewing them and creating them. So don't rely on your TC to pass on information. You've got to do it as well. Tania, did you have a question?
Yes, this is more towards the end of the contract. I went to one of the legislative days in Sacramento, and one of the lawyers was saying that she doesn't suggest we have our buyers sign the section where if there's a dispute, oh my gosh, I can't think of what the word is.
Arbitration and mediation.
Yeah, mediation. She felt that she wouldn't have her buyers sign the mediation because if something happened, she wanted her buyers to be able to sue. What's the company's stance on that?
I mean, I would think that, I don't know if the company would have a stance because it is optional on both sides, but I know just from like a practical application that if sometimes I'll have those accidentally not signed, like it's hard to get a contract accepted without it. And it's something that obviously I think you'd want to discuss with the listing agent if your buyer is definitely not going to sign that. But I don't know. I mean, I think the company stance would be to sign it because it is protection. But Karina, do you know anything
About like whether EXP wants that arbitration mediation signed or not? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, obviously, yes, it would it is technically optional, but ideally both parties agree to it so that we actually have some place to kind of start from if things go sideways, like John said, from a practical standpoint, absolutely get those initialed. You'll get every once in a while, you'll get pushback from attorneys that don't actually want to sign it. At least that's in my experience. For people that are actually like not wanting to initial it usually happen to be attorneys, right, John? And
it doesn't surprise me that it's an attorney that would say, because that's essentially like they're signing a clause that like cuts out like her ability to provide her services. And from what I understand too, is it doesn't completely preclude you from suing. It just requires you to at least attempt arbitration and mediation first. And one thing that I learned is that you as an agent are not party to that clause is just between the buyer and seller. And if there is issues after and they do have to go into arbitration mediation, you as an agent are not required to be party to that unless, I've had one in my 7-something years that went into that. I had the buyers, they were all good. But I got pulled into it because the sellers wanted their agent to be involved in it. And their agent's brokerage said we would only participate in it if the buyer's agent's brokerage participated in it. But that's just between the buyers and sellers. But to answer your question, I would think that if there's probably not a company stance because it is optional, but in most situations or most cases, everybody involved would want people to sign it. And it doesn't surprise me that it's attorneys that don't agree with it necessarily.
So quick question there, John. It's funny you say that. That has happened to me as well. And the seller did happen to be an attorney on that property. And that was the only time I had an issue. But my question was, so if buyer agrees to those terms, but obviously an attorney isn't agreeing to those terms, does that make the contract not ratified? Or can one agree and not agree and it be ratified?
So that's something where one can, if both parties don't agree, then those sections don't, it's still a ratified contract, but those sections don't apply. And this is getting like a little more technical, but sometimes you'll hear situations where a listing agent will send a counter offer for signature, and they'll just send the counter offer. What you're supposed to do is have the seller's initial the RPA, and then also initial, put that it's subject to a counter offer, and then send the counter offer also. The people will ask, like, if the counter offer alone is enough to like constitute an agreement, so you don't know if the seller signed it. From what I understand, a counter offer on its own is enough to create a contract. But the reason that you might want to be careful signing a counter when you haven't seen the RPA is if your buyers sign that counter, and then they see that the seller hasn't signed that, and then they get the RPA and the seller hasn't signed that liquidated damage or the arbitration and mediation section, like they've already ratified the contract because they signed the counter. But to answer your question, no, it is still a ratified contract without those sections. It just means those sections don't apply if both parties haven't signed.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Totally. And what I do is, because it's difficult to get I think I might have said this, but just it's worth repeating, because it's difficult to get contracts accepted without it, and because it does show up as optional when you send it through DocuSign, is that when we write our first offer, you need to be explaining those clauses in detail anyway. I explain both of those, the liquidated damages and the arbitration mediation, and then I tell the clients that I'm just going to make sure they agree to it, and then I make it a required field on DocuSign, because a lot of times, even if they are fine with signing it, the way the DocuSign is set up, when it's optional, it's easy to get skipped. And then sometimes you forget as an agent, and then you send it in, and then the listing agent points out that you missed it, and then you're going back and like cleaning up for missing initials. So for me also, it's a good like reminder to make sure you explain those, because you're going to make them required on the DocuSign. Anything else on inspection contingencies? Okay, cool. So the other two are a little more straightforward. There's the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency, and they're usually the same amount of days. When it comes to the length of those, I basically just ask the lender, and this is usually a conversation I have, when I get new clients, if they're using a lender that I'm not familiar with, is I'll talk to the lender and I'll say, what do you want to see for loan and appraisal contingencies? And if they say, we need 15 days or whatever, then I always ask, I tell them I want to be aggressive as possible, but not be in a position where you're asking for extension. And then they're saying like, oh, we can push it and do 10 or whatever. But I let the lender dictate how long you have for close of escrow, which is an additional offer term. And then for the loan and appraisal contingencies, the loan is pretty straightforward. It just gives the clients time to get their loan fully approved. There'll be trainings on financing down the road, but basically like different lenders will do different levels of review of a client's file before they issue them approval. A good lender will essentially fully underwrite a client before approving them. So basically like do all of the work to approve the loan. The only thing that's missing is the property. And, when you hear about people writing no loan contingencies, it's because they have a lender that's gone through the underwriting process almost entirely, minus the property and the appraisal. So any potential surprises that would come up, say the lender asks for, verification of certain types of income, or they just need additional documents or whatever, that's all already come up. And that's where you ideally want to be, is you want to be working with lenders that do as much upfront. I typically tell buyers, like, if it seems like a hassle upfront, that's a good thing, because that means that there's less chance of there's surprises. There being surprises once your offer is accepted. If a buyer just sent a couple basic documents in and then got a pre-approval letter and that's it, that makes you a little nervous, because then there could be things that come up. And not to get too far into financing, but when we're discussing this kind of thing, I ask my buyers, if I don't already know, like, about their situation. Like, if you have the two self-employed people, the chances of their financing being, the underwriting process being more complicated is a lot higher if you have, one person and a partner that does not work, and that one person has had the same W-2 job for the last 10 years. Like, the moving parts to their finances are a lot lower. Same thing. But then if that person had 5 rental properties and 60% of income comes from rentals, then that's something that you want to make sure really gets reviewed, before removing the loan contingency. So the loan contingency is there to give the buyer time to fully approve it. And I typically, will wait. A lender will tell you we have full approval, or we have conditional approval, but the conditions are just verification of employment, or they need some statement that the buyer knows they can get. And then, I like to just, as a matter of practice, like, have it in writing, whether an email or text, like, that the lender says the loan's fully approved and that we can go ahead and remove the contingency. Appraisal contingency is straightforward in a sense, but it's getting a little trickier because of how people are using it in this market. But appraisal contingency is there to protect the buyer in the event the property appraises for lower than the purchase price. So lenders are only going to lend up to the appraised value of a property. So if you're putting 20% down and you're buying a property for $1 million there with an $800,000 loan, then you need the property to appraise for $1 million. If it appraises lower, then the buyer is responsible for making up the gap in the appraised value and the purchase price. So in that same situation, you have $1 million purchase price, it appraises low for $950,000. That buyer is now responsible for $50,000 difference. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to pay that $50,000. There's a couple things that could happen. Like, obviously, one, the buyer just comes up with the $50,000. Two is the seller lowers the purchase price by $50,000. Three is some kind of compromise or mix where, the buyer comes up with $25,000 and the seller lowers the purchase price $25,000 or whatever, some kind of, combined way of getting to a price where the buyer and seller agree works, and the buyer can do that. If you have a client, and a lot of buyers are like this, less so it seems like these days, but they're using all of their money just to have the down payment and closing costs, and they maybe want to have a couple bucks left to do a little bit of work on the house, then you need that appraisal contingency. Because if you are in a position where you need to come up with 10, 15, 20, $200,000 to bridge the gap between appraised value and the purchase price, and your buyers can't do it, then you're in a position where you might have to breach the contract. So if you don't have that appraisal contingency, then you're in trouble. So that's there to protect you if the price comes up short. When you hear about people waiving it, typically that means they do have some way to, in that risk that's created by the potential shortfall, they have additional cash to do it. So that's something that's happening more and more in this market, because with these huge values, sellers really want to be confident in the purchase price that they're getting. So with stuff going way over asking, or with new comps and new kind of records being broken in neighborhoods every day, appraisals can play a big part in it. So not having an appraisal contingency sometimes will mean, and this happened to me recently, where we got our offer accepted at 710 with no appraisal over an offer that was 725. that had a appraisal contingency, because that 725 of the appraisal contingency, if that appraisal comes in at 680, that seller is now, you know, $45,000 short if the buyers can't come up with it. And normally if a buyer could come up with it, they would waive the contingency because it makes a stronger offer. So being able to waive an appraisal contingency is something that can really help your offer be stronger, but it's something that you would never do unless you actually had, you know, you plan for the worst case scenario of buyers having to come up with additional funds and them being okay with that. And it needs to be the buyer's decision, and they need to fully understand the risk that they're taking, because, you know, some buyers might want to waive it just because they know it's going to give them a better chance. But they need to understand what that actually means, because it could put them in a tough position. Those same clients, they were writing in an area where appraisals would be an issue. And in order to get to being able to write offers that were, you know, 700 and change and waive appraisal, they actually ended up going with a 10% down loan. Like we knew that waiving appraisal would be really influential in offers. So I had them discuss with their lender in detail, like, hey, what are the numbers on a 10% down loan with mortgage insurance rather than 20% down? Because if they put 10% down, then they now had an extra 70 grand to cover an appraisal shortfall, which they needed because it did appraise for like 670 or something like that. But everybody knew it would. So understanding appraisal contingency has gotten even more important in this market, because it is a lever that you can pull when you're trying to make your offer more competitive if your clients have that option. Does that make sense, everyone? I know it can be a little tricky to wrap your head around if you haven't actually dealt with it yet, but any questions on appraisal contingency? Okay, and then last thing on that I want to mention is, Christina, do you have a question?
No, I said not yet. I'm sure I'll have a million when it actually happens.
Yeah, and it's important as a new agent, like, and that's why, you know, you have resources on the team to make sure you answer those questions. Like, you want to obviously understand it in as much detail as possible before you're writing offers. But if you're in a situation where, you know, your client wants to waive it and you're not, you want to make sure you want, you know, everybody's on the same page and they understand exactly what waiving it means. Like, don't just risk going through it because you don't want it to be obvious that you don't know what you don't know, because you could put himself in a sticky situation. Last thing I want to mention on that, and this is something that's come up a lot, is you'll hear about these situations where people are, you know, they don't have enough cash to where they can just like completely waive it, but they do have a little bit of extra cash. So you'll hear people say like, okay, you put a clause in the contract where, you know, if you ever do this, you know, make sure you're getting it worded right. But basically something that states that in the event that the property appraises below the purchase price, the buyer will pay X amount over the appraised value. So that's a way to kind of reassure the seller, okay, if it does appraise low, we do have some extra money, because usually if in a property where the seller and the listing agent are worried about appraisal, they'll have some kind of ballpark idea of like, well, at least it's, you know, we have this comp, at the very least it's going to appraise for this. And then they'll be like, okay, and they'll pay $50,000 over that. Super important to remember, if you're going to use a clause like that, and this is a mistake that I know people have made, if you're going to use a clause where, you know, we'll pay X amount over appraised value, you still have you're not waiving the appraisal contingency, because just because you have that clause in there, it doesn't change the fact that your buyers are obligated to pay the contract purchase price. So a seller might agree to it, but then it might come in way lower than everybody thought. And even with the little kicker that they'll pay on top of the appraised value, it's too low. Your buyer is still in contract to pay that purchase price. So if you waive the appraisal contingency or all your contingencies, and now the seller isn't going to take the $50,000 over the appraised value, your buyer is in trouble. So you want that appraisal contingency in there, but having that clause kind of softens the blow to a seller of having the appraisal contingency. Karina, did you want to add anything on that?
Just what you said, make sure you keep that appraisal contingency, because we've had that happen where people waive that contingency thinking that having the language about just going up over 10K over the appraised value and making up that deficit is enough to protect the buyers, but it's not. They're on the hook for the entire shortfall if they don't have that appraisal contingency to protect them. And also I have to wrap up and jump on my huddle, but you're doing awesome, John. Keep it going. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Karina. All right. Any questions on appraisal contingency, or does somebody want to try? I know it's a hard one because it's something that we have to talk about a lot. So is there a new agent that wants to try to explain it to me, and we can critique your explanation because it's a tricky one to explain? Anyone? Someone want to explain appraisal contingency like you would to a client?
I mean, I could take a stab at it.
Go for it, Sasha.
Okay, I mean, the way that I kind of put it down in my buyer's consultation is that, here, just one second. Is that I basically would say that the appraisal contingency is in place to just ensure the property is listed at a fair market value, and gives them the ability to back out of the contract if the property doesn't appraise for the amount that they offered to pay without losing their EMD. So I broke it up into like 3 scenarios. Like one would be if it didn't appraise for the amount that that the buyer is willing to pay. First, we'd be trying to see if the seller would be willing to lower the purchase price to what the amount the property was appraised at. And if that didn't work, then try to maybe go a 50-50 split. And then if that didn't work, which, you know, obviously a seller's market might make it difficult, then obviously they'd have to come in and play the difference entirely in cash, because generally the lenders aren't allowed to lend more than what the property is worth. So that was basically my understanding of it.
Yeah, that's pretty much there. You just want to make sure that when you talk about that, you know, that third scenario, that where the buyer has to make up the difference in cash, that you kind of circle back and explain, and then we have that appraisal contingency if that's something that you're not able to do. And I don't think that you need to talk about how it's in relation to like fair market value, because in this crazy market, like nobody really knows what that is. So like, I think the way to explain it is like the way to kind of sum it up is the appraisal contingency is there to protect you if the appraised value is lower than the purchase price, because the bank will only loan up to the appraised value. But I mean, I think you get it. I think just working on how you're explaining it. But yeah, the market value, I mean, comps are if you talk to a lot of agents that are writing offers and trying to figure out purchase price, like comps are kind of useless, and it makes appraisals it makes it really difficult to determine what something is worth. And two, it makes it difficult. I mean, if you as an agent can't like look at the comps and figure out what you should write as an offer, an appraiser's job is just as difficult, even more difficult, because there's like certain guidelines they have to follow. And just kind of give an example, and I'm sure there's a bunch of crazy stories like this about like values, is I had a listing recently and it was in a neighborhood where that's easy to comp in the sense that like all the houses are kind of roughly the same. It was like a development where they were all built within the same couple of years. There's the houses don't range a lot from size. There's, 1,800 square foot 3 bedrooms and, 2,500 square foot 4 bedroom, 2 baths. They're all generally the same. So it's a neighborhood that's easier to comp. Oakland or other cities will have areas that are really difficult because like you'll have an 800 square foot house, and then the 3 homes that have sold in a half-mile radius about it are all 2,000 square feet. This one, the comps were all pretty straightforward. But that even being said, like there was if you looked at the comps, this listing that we listed at 1.4 looked like it was maybe like 1.5-ish. So there was 2 comps pending that were 1.6-ish. But if you're just looking at the sold values, like, and trying to figure out what to offer, like, you don't know. We ended up selling for 1.75, which was like $200,000 above any of the sold comps. But nobody would have guessed that. It appraised for $100,000 below the purchase price, which even I thought was like high for the appraisal, because there was no all the comps said 1.5. And so you hear more and more stories like that in this market where like there's no comps to support a purchase price, but because there's so much demand for some areas and some homes, it doesn't matter what the data says. And what I always tell my clients when we're talking about appraisals and values is it doesn't really matter what the comps say. All that really matters is what somebody else is willing to pay. And if somebody's willing to pay it, then that's the value of the home. So getting your clients to wrap their head around the fact that like, things are going for way over the comps is something that, you want to practice, because it's something that you're going to have to explain at some point in this market. Hopefully not for too much longer or for a lot longer, depending on how you look at it. But I mean, it's just crazy out there when it comes to appraisals. So I've gotten to the point where I don't speculate like on, you know, if something's going to appraise or if it's not going to appraise, because in the last couple of years, the two properties that I was like the most worried about that weren't going to appraise are actually the same two properties that were the only two properties that went for over the appraised value, that appraised for over the purchase price, which doesn't really happen often because a lot of times appraisers are just trying to hit that purchase price because that's kind of their job and that's what makes it life easier for everybody. So thanks for stepping up, Sasha. If anyone has any questions on contingencies in general, raise your hand. Otherwise, I think that's it. I know we spent a lot of time on it, but there's a lot riding on contingencies. And so your understanding of contingencies is super important because you can put your buyers in a tough position if they don't fully understand what they're agreeing to. Cool. All right. So we just have a few minutes left. I'll go through real quick and we'll pick this up next week on some of these additional forms. We talked a little bit about this last week, the different scenarios that can happen when sellers respond to an offer. And these are the forms that they use. So a seller counteroffer is the form that the seller uses when they're writing a counteroffer. So pretty straightforward. You know, they'll put in if they want you to change terms or price or whatever. Buyers can either choose to just accept the seller counteroffer if there's specific terms that they want to agree to, or if the seller counteroffer is, you know, buyer to submit their highest and best, then the buyer responds using a form that's the buyer counteroffer. And then if the seller agrees to the buyer counteroffer, they sign that, and that creates a contract. The seller multiple counteroffer is a form that's used if the seller is responding to more than one party. So if you get a counter, it's important to note, and usually you'll be discussing it with the agent, but it's important to note if it's counteroffer or a multiple counteroffer. If it's counteroffer, then you're the only one at the table, and if you agree to it or, you know, step up, you have a better chance. If it's a multiple counteroffer, then there are other parties that have a chance at it, and the sellers aren't obligated to respond to every multiple counter or wait for a response for every multiple counter. So somebody could send out 5 multiple counteroffers, you could be one of them. Somebody could respond 10 minutes later with a great, you know, we'll come up with $50,000 and waive all our contingencies. They don't have to wait for you to turn in your multiple counteroffer. If they're happy with the response that they get from it, and a buyer counteroffer is the form that you use to respond to it. If the seller's happy with the response they get, you've missed out on your chance. So when it comes to like time being of the essence, getting a seller multiple counter is one time where you're really scrambling around to get a hold of your buyers because you don't want the seller to accept something without you having a chance. Normally, you know, a seller is going to wait to see what comes in from everybody before making a decision. But if someone just gives them, you know, everything they want and more, they could just take it without waiting for responses from anyone. So like I've literally been like in weird spots on the phone, like running around trying to talk to my buyers about this multiple counter situation because you want to get your response in as soon as possible. Addendum forms are, it's the ADM, and when you in zip forms, you'll see there's a bunch of addendum forms because they're just generic forms, and then you'll use them anytime there's you're adding a term to the contract. So say you do, you know, negotiate a price reduction or, you know, I can't think of examples right now, but the buyer is gonna, the seller is gonna pay for something or whatever. If you need to incorporate new terms into the contract, you do that on an addendum form. Also, sometimes if you're, you know, changing, something was misspelled or something or whatever, like these two forms are used. Amendment of existing agreement or addendum, they're the forms that are used to modify an existing ratified purchase contract. Any questions on addendums? One thing to note is addendums they're blank forms with a little spot on top for a number, and they're sequential. So it's like, obviously the first one is addendum 1, addendum 2, addendum 3. We haven't talked about it a lot, but typically you want to keep any language referring to repairs or inspections off of the contract. Because of all these forms, the only forms that actually go to the lender and usually title is the RPA. So you want to keep that clear of anything that references repairs or inspections, because if the lender sees it, then they might request the repair, they might request the inspection reports. And if they see that it's $20,000 worth of dry rot, they might require the seller complete that, which probably isn't going to happen, in order to move forward with the loan. So I note that on addendums because they are like sequential. So like if you have addendum 1 that has a bunch of stuff about, buyer to credit, or seller to credit buyer $5,000 towards repairs, then, and that's somehow like the lender, then there's an addendum that the lender needs to see, and that's addendum number 2. They might ask for addendum number 1. This is something that's never even happened to me, but has always been like drilled into my head, that you're really careful about what the lender gets. So a lot of the times when you're talking about credits for repairs, the way they're written is like, buyer to seller, credit seller $5,000 towards closing costs, because to a lender, like that doesn't raise any red flags. It's just an agreement between the buyer and seller. Any questions on addendums? Okay, cool. We'll go into the rest of this list. We have like a couple minutes left, and I want to be able to go into detail on these forms a little bit on the rest of these. So we'll cover that next week. We have a couple minutes left. If anyone has any random questions related to forms or anything that's come up recently or anything we talked about. Anyone got anything?
Nothing.
You always
Yeah.
count.
I swear literally have a million. I'll be so annoying once I'm in this actual situation. I think just because I haven't experienced it yet, I don't know what to ask.
Totally. Yeah, no, it is difficult. And that's why, like, as these trainings, I try not to go into too much detail, like, because and once I can talk about what a seller counteroffer is, but the first time that you have to fill one out or respond to one, then you're going to have questions. So feel free to ask them when they do come up, and that's why we have Karina's noon huddle is like a great place for that, because you can jump in and ask specific questions that you have. That's what people will use it for. It's like, I need to make sure I'm filling out this whatever properly. I'll jump into it and ask the question and then move on. So we try to have a number of different resources for the agents out there for specific contract questions once you're actually dealing with these forms.
John, I won't be able to be on Thursday's call.
Okay, no worries. It's all good, and they'll be recorded anyway.
Okay.
All right. Well, any other questions while we're together? Cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We'll finish 2 minutes early today. Use that 2 minutes to do something productive and make a call or do some studying or practice something. But appreciate everybody taking time to show up to these trainings, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Bye.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Appreciate it.